Nicholas Whitmore thought he had a perfect marriage, until one night, everything unraveled before his eyes. A familiar name whispered too often. A late-night meeting that wasn't just about work. And then, the moment that shattered everything. A quiet dinner for two, where he wasn't invited. But instead of falling apart, he did something no one expected. This is the story of how one man turned betrayal into the ultimate comeback. Nicholas Whitmore stepped out of his car, exhaustion weighing heavily on his shoulders. The dim glow of the porch light illuminated the driveway, a small beacon of familiarity after an unforgiving 36-hour shift in the emergency room. His hands ached. His mind felt sluggish, but a quiet sense of satisfaction kept him upright. Lives had been saved, crises averted, and now he was home, where the world was supposed to be stable and predictable. As he stepped inside, something felt different. The house was silent, almost unnaturally so. The air held an odd stillness, the kind that prickled at the back of his neck. It wasn't just quiet, it was absent of life. He set his briefcase down, rubbing the tension from his forehead, when the faint sound of laughter carried from the kitchen. His muscles tensed. The laughter was light, playful, familiar in a way that should have been comforting but wasn't. Moving carefully, he followed the sound, each step slow and measured. As he neared the doorway, a name drifted toward him, spoken in a tone too soft, too amused. "Drew, you're impossible." Catherine's voice. The warmth in it sent a cold sensation crawling down his spine. He remained unseen, lingering in the shadow of the hallway, listening as her voice dipped into something softer, something teasing. The name Drew had been coming up more and more in their conversations lately, always accompanied by a laugh, a casual mention, a fleeting expression she didn't think he noticed. His grip tightened involuntarily, a dull throb pulsing through his fingers. Forcing his breath to steady, he stepped into the kitchen. Catherine stood at the counter, phone pressed to her ear, a smile lingering on her lips. The moment she saw him, the smile flickered. An instant of surprise, quickly replaced with something more neutral. "Oh, Nick, you're home," she said, a fraction too quickly. She turned slightly, as if shielding herself from his scrutiny. "I have to go," she added into the phone before ending the call. He studied her carefully, searching for something in her expression. But whatever had been there a moment ago was gone. A mask of normalcy settled over her features. She shifted a few papers on the counter, a pointless gesture, as if needing something to occupy her hands. "How was work?" she asked, voice even. Nick hesitated. "Busy. We had a guy come in with severe injuries from an accident. Almost lost his hand." Usually, she would ask for details, always fascinated by his cases. But tonight, she only nodded, her gaze distant. He exhaled slowly, then tried a different approach. "I was thinking about our anniversary next month. 5 years. Maybe we should do something special." There was the briefest pause, the kind that wouldn't mean much to most people, but to him it spoke volumes. Then she forced a smile, one that didn't quite reach her eyes. "Of course, we can figure something out." That was it. No excitement, no playful teasing about gifts. Just a vague response, as though she hadn't given it any thought at all. A pit formed in his stomach, but he refused to acknowledge it. Maybe she was just tired. Maybe he was overthinking things. Still, something felt wrong. "I'm going to shower and get some sleep," he said finally, watching her reaction closely. She nodded without looking up. "All right, sleep well." As Nick climbed the stairs, the unease in his gut deepened. Something was shifting between them, and he wasn't sure if he wanted to know what it was. The following weeks did nothing to put his mind at ease. If anything, the feeling only grew worse. Catherine's late nights at work became more frequent, always justified with vague explanations. Client meetings, last-minute deadlines, unexpected emergencies. And then there was the scent. It clung to her clothes, subtle yet foreign, a sharp and musky cologne that did not belong to him. One night, she returned well past midnight, her movements slightly unsteady as she entered the house. Nick, seated in the dim light of the living room, observed her as she hesitated at the door, as if considering whether to acknowledge his presence. "You're home late," he remarked, his voice deliberately neutral. She startled slightly, then offered a quick smile. "Yeah, client emergency. Drew and I had to stay late to sort things out." There it was again. That name. Nick nodded, though the explanation sat uneasily within him. He didn't argue, didn't press her for details. But the weight in his chest grew heavier. Work became his escape. The relentless pace of the ER provided a distraction, a place where emotions were set aside in favor of action and precision. Here he was needed. Here things made sense. Yet even in the middle of the chaos, his mind would wander back to the silence of his home, to the way Catherine's eyes no longer lingered on his, to the way she seemed to exist just slightly beyond his reach. And as much as he tried to ignore it, to convince himself he was imagining things, a truth he didn't want to face began creeping into the corners of his mind. Nicholas Whitmore had always believed that the truth had a way of revealing itself. He just never thought it would happen so soon, so clearly, and so cruelly. It started as a plan to rekindle what they once had. Their anniversary was approaching, and despite the lingering doubts and unanswered questions, he wanted to believe things could be salvaged. He had made reservations at an upscale restaurant, a place Catherine had once loved, back when they spent hours lost in conversation over candlelight. He had even picked out a gift, a delicate necklace she had admired in passing months ago, a reminder of the little things he still noticed about her. That evening, he left the hospital early, eager to surprise her. As he drove, he allowed himself a rare sliver of optimism. Maybe tonight would be a turning point. Maybe the distance between them would close, and they would laugh the way they used to. Maybe he had been wrong about everything. But as he approached the restaurant, a strange sight made his steps falter. Through the window, at a table for two, sat Catherine. And she wasn't alone. A man leaned toward her, their hands resting together on the table. She was smiling, no glowing. The way she used to smile at him. The way she hadn't smiled in months. His breath caught, the world narrowing to that single moment. The ambient noise of the city became a dull roar in his ears as he watched her tuck a loose strand of hair behind her ear, an unconscious habit he knew well. The man across from her, Drew it had to be, spoke in a low voice, drawing another soft laugh from her. A sound he hadn't heard in far too long. Nick remained outside, frozen, his fingers curling into fists at his sides. He had spent weeks dismissing his suspicions, rationalizing her behavior, convincing himself that he was imagining things. But the evidence was in front of him now, undeniable and devastating. Finally, his body moved on its own. Pushing open the restaurant door, he stepped inside. The warmth and chatter of the space barely registered as he made his way toward their table. Catherine's gaze lifted, her expression shifting instantly. Surprise, then guilt, then a carefully constructed mask of neutrality. The man across from her leaned back slightly, as if assessing the situation. There was no shame in his eyes, only a quiet challenge, as though he had expected this confrontation and welcomed it. Nick didn't acknowledge him. His attention remained on Catherine, watching her posture, the way she shifted under his gaze. His hand reached into his pocket, fingers closing around the small velvet box. It had been meant as a gift, a symbol of their shared history. Now it felt like a cruel joke. Without a word, he set it on the table. The gesture was simple, final. He turned away without another glance, pushing past the clatter of silverware and hushed whispers of nearby diners. The cold air outside was a stark contrast to the suffocating warmth of the restaurant. He inhaled deeply, steadying himself. The weight pressing against his chest had shifted. Less of a burden now, more of a resolution. His phone buzzed in his pocket, breaking his thoughts. He pulled it out, glancing at the screen. A missed call from Vince Randall. Nick hesitated only a moment before calling back. The lawyer answered on the second ring, his voice brisk and efficient. Plans were already being set in motion. The moment of hesitation was gone. Nick's gaze flickered back to the restaurant, but only briefly. He had all the answers he needed. There was nothing left to salvage, nothing left to hold on to. His future no longer included Catherine, and for the first time in a long time he was okay with that. Nicholas Whitmore moved with mechanical precision as he stepped into his lawyer's office the next afternoon. Vince Randall had already laid out the groundwork for what was to come, and as Nick lowered himself into the chair across from him, there was no hesitation left in his mind. He had spent the previous night staring at the ceiling, piecing together every clue, every moment of doubt, until the reality of Catherine's betrayal had settled in fully. There was no room for emotion anymore, just action. Vince wasted no time. His office was sleek and orderly, much like the man himself. A stack of legal documents sat on the desk, and he gestured toward them as soon as Nick sat down. "We move fast," he said, his voice crisp. "Everything's in motion. You'll be filing as the plaintiff. We're going after full control of assets. I've got a financial advisor on board to ensure she doesn't walk away with more than she deserves." Nick listened, absorbing the details, though his thoughts drifted elsewhere. He wasn't angry. Anger was fleeting, impulsive. What he felt now was colder, a steady resolve that no longer entertained the idea of reconciliation. His marriage had ended long before last night. The only thing left to do was make sure he walked away unscathed. The next few weeks passed in a blur of paperwork, legal meetings, and quiet, calculated preparations. He had started the process of dividing their shared finances, tracking every withdrawal Catherine had made over the past months. Patterns emerged. Frequent, unexplained expenses, transactions that lined up a little too neatly with her late nights. Vince and his team documented everything. Each piece of evidence was another nail in the coffin of her case. Meanwhile, Catherine's demeanor shifted in ways he had anticipated. At first, she avoided confrontation, retreating into polite indifference as if pretending nothing had changed. Then came the late-night texts, subtle attempts to gauge where he stood. Apologies laced with half-truths, framed in ways that left just enough room for doubt. When those failed to elicit a response, she turned defensive, making excuses that contradicted her own words from weeks before. Nick said nothing. Engaging would have been pointless. Every interaction with her was reduced to transactions, logistics about the house, finances, and legal arrangements. Whatever history they had, whatever warmth once existed between them, had been replaced by sterile necessity. Through it all, his work became a refuge. The ER remained a constant, chaotic force in his life, one that required his full attention. Long hours blurred into one another, filled with the hum of medical equipment and the urgency of split-second decisions. Here he had control. Here his actions had immediate, tangible consequences. One evening, a colleague stopped him in the hallway, concern evident in her expression. "You've been different lately," she remarked, watching him closely. "More focused. It's like nothing shakes you." Nick only nodded. He had no need to explain. The truth was, the turmoil of his personal life had burned away any distractions. There was no room for hesitation anymore. By the time Catherine's first legal response arrived, Vince was already 3 steps ahead. She had attempted to make claims, attempts at painting herself as the wounded party, but the evidence dismantled them with clinical efficiency. Screenshots, bank statements, phone records. Vince had built an airtight case before she even realized she was losing control of the narrative. Nick barely registered the legal battles unfolding around him. He signed documents when needed, listened to Vince's updates, but the outcome was already clear. It wasn't about revenge. It was about making sure the person who had spent months deceiving him didn't get to rewrite the story on her terms. One evening, as he sat in his office at the hospital, his phone buzzed with another message. Catherine's name flashed on the screen. He stared at it for a moment, then deleted it without opening it. The path forward was already set. There was no looking back. Nicholas Whitmore had always been a man of discipline, and now, in the midst of his unraveling marriage, he wielded that discipline like a weapon. The legal battle was progressing in his favor, every maneuver carefully orchestrated by Vince Randall. Catherine had underestimated him. She had mistaken his silence for passivity, but in reality, it was calculation. The house, the joint accounts, the assets. They were all slipping from her grasp, piece by piece. She hadn't even realized how thoroughly he had prepared for this moment. While she had been sneaking around, wrapped up in her own deception, he had been quietly ensuring that when the truth came to light, she would have nothing left to stand on. Her attempts to control the situation grew more desperate. She started showing up at the house unexpectedly, her demeanor shifting between indignant and pleading. One evening, she lingered by the doorway, eyes scanning the home they once shared, as if looking for something that might tether her to the life she was watching slip away. "You don't have to do this," she had finally said, her voice soft, calculated. "We can find a way through this, Nick." But he had already detached himself from the weight of her words. There was nothing to salvage. She had made her choices, and now she had to live with them. Without responding, he had simply walked past her, his focus already elsewhere. At the hospital, his reputation was only growing stronger. His colleagues noted the shift in him, not a man breaking under personal turmoil, but one who thrived despite it. Promotions and recognition came swiftly. The department ran with greater efficiency under his guidance, and soon an offer was made Chief of Emergency Medicine. It was an opportunity that cemented his future, one that would place him in a position of influence he hadn't considered before. The irony wasn't lost on him. While Catherine's life unraveled, his own was reaching new heights. Rumors began to circulate, subtle at first. A few colleagues mentioned whispers of Catherine spreading falsehoods, claims that he was unstable, that the stress had changed him. He didn't react. Let her talk. Words meant nothing against the reputation he had built. If anything, it only made her look more desperate. Still, he made his own moves in the background. He ensured that anything left in their shared name was untangled before she could attempt any financial retaliation. Vince had already gathered documentation of her withdrawals, each transaction painting a damning picture of her intent. It was no longer just infidelity, it was calculated deceit, and in the eyes of the court it would work against her. The final shift came one evening when he found an unfamiliar email sitting in his inbox. The subject line was simple: "Thought you should know." Attached were messages, ones he hadn't yet seen, ones that erased whatever shred of dignity Catherine might have had left. Her conversations with Drew were explicit, time-stamped long before he had confronted her at the restaurant. The proof was undeniable. She hadn't just stumbled into an affair. It had been deliberate, premeditated. Nick sat back in his chair, the glow of the screen reflecting in his tired eyes. There was no anger left, no grief, just certainty. He forwarded the email to Vince without a word. The next morning, new legal motions were filed, tightening the noose around her case. By the time Catherine realized the depth of her mistake, it was too late. She had nothing left to leverage, no false narratives to cling to. The court's decision was swift. The house was his. The assets were his. She was left with nothing but her personal belongings and a dwindling account balance. Nick stood outside the courthouse on the day the verdict was finalized, feeling nothing but a quiet satisfaction. The battle was over and he had won. Nicholas Whitmore had expected some level of closure when the divorce was finalized. What he hadn't expected was the sheer weightlessness that followed. The court's decision had left Catherine with almost nothing. No home, no significant assets, no sympathy from the people who once surrounded her. The moment the judge's ruling was announced, she had looked across the courtroom at him, searching for something in his expression. If she had been hoping for hesitation, she found none. Days turned into weeks, and the remnants of their shared life faded quickly. He sold the house, removing the last physical connection to a past that no longer held any meaning. The career that had once been a source of stability now became a pathway forward. As Chief of Emergency Medicine, his authority was unquestioned. His focus on his work, sharper than ever. Colleagues respected him, and those who had once whispered about the scandal surrounding his marriage now only spoke of his leadership. Meanwhile, Catherine had vanished into obscurity. The woman who once carried herself with quiet confidence was now reduced to a shadow of what she had been. Friends distanced themselves, unwilling to be caught in the fallout of her actions. Drew, the man she had risked everything for, had disappeared almost immediately after the trial. He had no interest in the consequences of what they had done. Catherine was left to fend for herself in a world that no longer cared about her excuses. Nick had not seen her in months when their paths crossed again. It was late, another long shift winding down, when he spotted a familiar figure in the waiting area of the hospital. She sat hunched over, hands clasped together, her once pristine appearance now worn and tired. Next to her, Drew looked worse, sweat beading on his forehead, pain evident in his posture. Nick hesitated for only a moment before stepping forward, professionalism overriding whatever personal history lay between them. The brief interaction was clinical. Drew was suffering from a condition that required immediate surgery, something that would have been far more serious had he waited any longer. Catherine barely spoke, her voice subdued, as if the fight had left her entirely. Nick examined Drew without emotion, noting the deterioration in his condition. The man who had once worn arrogance so easily now looked fragile, dependent. Catherine's gaze flickered to Nick occasionally, searching, but he gave her nothing. The procedure was routine, efficient. When it was done, Nick handed off the case to another doctor. He had done his part. There was nothing left between them beyond the professional duty he had upheld. Before he left, Catherine caught his arm lightly, her touch hesitant. Her voice was barely above a whisper. "Nick, I—" He pulled away before she could finish. There was nothing she could say that mattered. No apology, no explanation, no attempt at redemption would rewrite what had already been done. Without a word, he turned and walked away, leaving her standing in the sterile light of the hospital corridor. Outside, the city hummed with life, indifferent to everything that had transpired. Nick inhaled deeply, the crisp night air filling his lungs. For the first time in a long while, he felt truly free. The past was behind him, reduced to nothing more than a lesson learned. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new opportunities. And this time he faced them unburdened, unshackled, ready.